Good morning, everybody. We're just bringing you in from the waiting room to get this webinar underway. So if you bear with us just for a few moments while we get people in from that waiting room. Fantastic. I think we've got most of you in now from the waiting room, so we will get started with today's webinar. I'm James from London Funders. It's fantastic to see so many of you joining us today for the discussion on how we can work together to respond to the current crisis and the longer term issues that are affecting our communities. This is the last event in the London Funders Cost of Living Week. Many of you have been on some of our other webinars and meetings over the course of the week, so you'll know that we've looked at issues in terms of hearing directly from community groups about the challenges that they face and that their communities face. We've looked in detail at how we can use data and insights to better understand the current issues and how we can respond. We focused in on some specialist issues about how we can give grants to individuals and how we can do that more effectively. And we've also heard about some of the latest research about how we can improve the experience of applying for funding, which is even more critical at times like this. As well as all of that, we've also tried to delve into some of the structural issues that have brought us to this point as well. And we've shared some research we've done recently on the funder response and some of the thinking that people are doing, both about this current crisis and the longer term issues that have been exposed in recent years as well. Today's session, as I say, is focused on working together. We're going to be looking at opportunities to collaborate to support London's communities through the crisis, because that's been a really strong message that's come through the research and the interviews that we've done with members, but it's also been a key theme that's come through the earlier sessions of this week as well. How do we respond and how can we do that together? So I'm joined by an amazing panel to take us through some of the considerations that we have for that. On screen with me, you'll see Kate Markey, who's Chief Exec at the London Community Foundation. You'll also see Yolande, who's Strategy Director for Communities at London Councils, Manny, who's Chief Exec at Trust for London, and Nezahat, Chief Exec at London Legal Support Trust. So our wonderful panel will share some initial reflections with you about where we are and where we go from here. We'll then have a bit of a discussion about some of the issues that have come up through that, and then we'll take any questions and thoughts from you as well. So if you're hopefully familiar with all this by now, you'll see at the bottom of your screen there's a Q&A box. If you've got a question or a point you'd like to put to the panel, if you pop it in the Q&A box, that's the one that's easier for me to keep an eye on and then bring that forward into the discussion. If you've got a general comment or you've got resources you want to share or you just want to connect with other people on the call, then you can use the chat box for that. And that's also if any resources get mentioned during the call, where we'll pop the links so you've got those as well. Hopefully that's all okay, and you'll be with us for the next 45 minutes or so as we go through this discussion. So do keep your questions, your thoughts, your reflections coming in the Q&A box, and we'll come to those in a moment. But for now, we'll start with some reflections and thoughts from our panel. So if I go in the order that I think I introduced you in, that you have just moved on my screen, I'll start with you, Kate, if I can, your thoughts on where we are and where we go.
So thanks, James, and thank you to London Funders for this week. I know the team LCF has really valued kind of the opportunity to engage and to kind of share insights and to learn specifically also kind of from some of the other foundations in the membership. Just to give you a bit of an overview as to where LCF is. So in those of you who don't know, LCF's model is that we're a donor advised fund model, but we raise all the funds that we deploy, and we dedicate our work to grassroots organisations, many of whom are operating under the radar of kind of some of the bigger mainstream funders. Early in the summer, we decided to, as many people did, and I'd be interested to know if actually if others found this as well, actually kind of we decided to do a very kind of light touch survey out to kind of grantees and organisations who previously had funding from us. And we're kind of somewhat overwhelmed by the kind of response that we had in the sense of both their own funding needs, but actually also kind of the pre-existing that hadn't gone away from COVID but had already started to rapidly accelerate kind of really challenging needs that kind of some of their groups and individuals were facing. And so we weren't expecting kind of that level of response for, you know, kind of during those summer months, and that really instigated us to launch Together for London, kind of a fundraising appeal that we launched in August. And again, actually kind of thinking, you know, why would you launch a fundraising appeal in August? Well, actually kind of we are in unprecedented circumstances. And I think actually, just as the Community Foundation, what we wanted to be is to be ready to act. I think what we've really tried to do in kind of the approach we've taken in Together for London is to adopt some of the incredible work and learning that we had from the COVID response that we did together. So kind of really trying to keep a kind of light touch, trying to kind of think about emergency in the first instance. And I know we're going to talk about kind of longer term as well, to really kind of think about priority groups, because we know that that's not everyone is equally impacted by the cost of living crisis. And to kind of really kind of think about actually kind of who needs those funds the most, but obviously kind of we are also kind of dependent on actually kind of what we raise. In parallel, we were also having conversations with some of our individual and corporate philanthropists who are behind quite a lot of our work. And I think, some of those conversations also reflect actually kind of probably kind of the wider conversations we've had also around this is incredibly political. Yes, actually kind of, to be blunt, actually there is a political choice as to kind of what's happening at the moment in terms of actually kind of the cost of living crisis. But it is political, and actually it's difficult, kind of for people to navigate that in terms of how they give. The scale of the impact, both in terms of, kind of the immediate and the kind of long term, and actually really recognizing just how long and deep some of this negative impact is going to have for some groups. And actually kind of really having those conversations with philanthropic partners has been interesting, because actually over and above that, actually kind of our response is yes, but we need to act, and really recognizing that, and also knowing that actually kind of people's investment endowment values are down as well. But I think actually as LCF, we've felt compelled to act, and that's kind of what we wanted to do. And actually also really taking, this is a really complicated issue, but actually kind of we're trying not to take a complicated response to actually kind of how we act in terms of supporting. And so, we're trying to kind of simplify actually kind of how we give in the first instance, and who we give to, because I think actually kind of the grassroots organisations that we support, that's how they are considering it, and actually that's what we're trying to kind of respond to. We are really concerned about the immediate, and then also kind of the long term. And actually kind of there's and who is I think we all know who's going to be kind of really dramatically and deeply affected by this. And actually kind of it goes without saying, and I think it's obvious, but need to say it again, actually kind of it's better when we do this together. All the learning that we had from the LCR, actually kind of we worked quicker, simpler and more impactfully when we did it together.
Brilliant, thank you, Kate. And I think colleagues have posted links in the chat to some of the resources you meant there in terms of the research, and also links to the appeal as well. So if colleagues are interested in exploring a bit more about what LCF have done so far, then all of that's in the chat there. And I think some really important themes as well that came up in some of our other sessions as well, about the complicated issue but not a complicated response. Some of those themes actually about how we make funding accessible to people, particularly when we're looking at grassroots groups and communities who are disproportionately affected. So thank you, Kate, for getting us going with that. Yolande, can I come to you next for the sort of perspective from where you sit at London Councils?
Thank you, James. And I'd just like to echo Kate's thanks to you and the team at London Funders for this week, which is incredible. And as Kate said, a really brilliant learning opportunity for us. I'm going to try not to repeat anything that Kate said, but I will probably press home some of the points that Kate made. So clearly, councils have provided a safety net to communities for years and are doing all they can to support people who are struggling with the cost of living. And some of that's kind of quite nuanced and important work. So from key messaging to destigmatise asking for support, which is hugely important as more and more people are asking for help, but many haven't done so before. So that's kind of quite a key piece of work. But then also through to ensuring information and support to things like accessing benefits and entitlements, skills and employment support is available in one place, but through many spaces. So things like GP surgeries, libraries, community settings, schools. And particularly with that area of work, boroughs know they can't do that without the voluntary community and faith sectors, who are absolutely our trusted partners and are the front line for so many Londoners. Now, obviously, boroughs continue to strengthen their relationships with BCSF partners. And those relationships we know are kind of challenged and changed, but also strengthened during COVID. So we also know that we need to continue to learn to work better together. But I just want to reinforce that point is we can't do it without voluntary community and faith sector partners. We know we can't fund our way out of this crisis, but financial support from the government for councils is crucial for us to continue to support people. But we want to work with government to find those long-term solutions to supporting residents and businesses in the capital. And those solutions have to be about supporting people to find ways to take their own action and be able to support themselves. Whilst we know that people are obviously facing crisis now and we need to do something about that now, we need to work in a way that recognises that some of those challenges we're facing will be with us for some time, like Kate said. You know, inflation will come down, but often the costs that have gone up, they won't come down. So cost of living as a challenge is going to be with us for some time. So we've got to remain proactive in what can feel like a really reactive time, and that's going to be crucial. Whilst obviously London councils and our borough's priority is supporting residents and businesses, boroughs are also dealing with cost of living and inflationary pressures as organisations. So fast rising costs combined with increased demand for services means that boroughs in the capital will need to make around £400 million worth of savings this year, and that could rise to as much as £700 million worth of savings next year without an uplift in funding, which is closer to the rate of inflation. So as well as continuing to ask government for immediate increases to things like household support fund, local housing allowance, providing more business rate relief for sectors hardest hit by energy costs, we will continue to ask government to work with London, to work with the boroughs, with London councils to support things like climate investment and retrofitting, unlock potential benefits of deeper devolution, broaden the balance of revenue raising powers available to councils so we can improve longer term financial resilience. And we will continue to press government for a better local government finance settlement that supports us to deliver the solutions that we and our partners know will make a difference for all Londoners. Thank you, James.
Brilliant. Thanks, Yolande. And I think, again, important points there, both about the sort of cross-sector approach. Now, this isn't always purely about the money or the activity. It's also about the wider messaging and the destigmatizing and the bringing together. But also those points about how some of this is baked in and risks causing other crises potentially. You know, there's ways of tackling cost of living as well as environmental crisis issues. But the scale of it, you talked about, you know, 400 to 700 million pounds worth of funding gap. From our mapping of members, that's roughly what our members give out in grants every year to the sector. So just as a sort of comparison point, quite big numbers and quite big challenges that we're going to be facing. So thank you for putting that on our radar, and again emphasising the cross-sector nature there, Yolande. Manny, can I come to you next in terms of your reflections from Trust for London?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks, James. Maybe I'm just going to reflect a little bit on the nature of this crisis and then talk about our response. And I think it's quite true. This cost of living crisis is going to push around, even with government support, it's going to push around 1.5 million people across the UK into poverty that weren't in poverty before the pandemic began. And that is probably the most seismic impact on headline poverty we've had for around 50 years. Definitely for 20 years, but before that, the data gets very, very patchy, so it's hard to know. But probably the 70s oil crisis is the last time that's had such an instant shock on people's ability to keep their head above water. But it's been a bit of a sort of slow bubbling crisis, I think. And it's taken a bit of time for people to really understand the scale of it. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is we've just come out of the pandemic, which was obviously a big shock of a crisis, and we were in it for so long. The second is the seasonal nature. Now, we've seen inflation rising for some time, but we didn't know it was going to be persistent, as persistent as it is until recently. And also you've had the summer, and people aren't thinking about heating in the summer. So when Kate launches something in August, that is really forward thinking, because people aren't always thinking about stuff at that particular time. So it's been a slow burn, but it is absolutely more seismic in terms of impact on poverty than the pandemic, because the pandemic had a raft of government policies that insulated people. So for us, there's definitely been a bit of time to just get that message across. This is serious stuff, and actually, it's very, very hard. I find it very, very hard to think about the long term right now. And as the trust that really likes to prioritise funding towards the root causes of poverty, I really struggle to think about the root causes of this problem being solved anytime soon. In fact, what we're talking about is humanitarian support. It's about helping people eat. It's about helping people keep warm. And those are pretty basic things for a society like ours. So actually, what we're doing is, yes, we've made the case to trustees that we need to put more money into this, just like we did in the pandemic and in the aftermath of the pandemic. It is tricky. The endowments are getting hit right now by the markets, but nevertheless, the scale of the crisis speaks for itself. So some of the things we're doing are we're giving uplifts to our current grantees of around 10. Many of them are getting around a 10% uplift, and we're having to make a difficult choice there. Do we give out money to new organisations next year that we aren't quite supporting yet, or do we keep the organisations we're currently supporting afloat? And we've gone with the latter. We're still going to give money to new organisations next year, but perhaps not as much, because we want to keep the work that's going, essentially. The second is emergency funds. So working with LCF, we have a brilliant infrastructure for getting money out quick, small grants out quickly that we don't have, to help those community organisations that will be on the front line of helping to provide the humanitarian support that we know will reach a lot of people, and then keeping some money back for some policy and campaigning work. So I don't want to be totally pessimistic about the long term. I think the way the politics has shifted does really open up some conversations for the city that probably wouldn't be there if the politics had stayed the same as they were before. So really thinking about ensuring that a positive future is discussed, whilst also defending some of the inevitable cuts that are going to potentially come to welfare and so forth. So it is a tricky time, but I view this very much as like, let's help, the immediate help to people that are going to need some serious support, basically.
Brilliant, thank you, Manny. And I think also really important contextual points as well. When we've talked a bit with members about the need to work collaboratively, people have often referenced the London Community Response as the example of how to work, which is great, but we have to acknowledge that that was on the back of a number of other policies that were out there. You know, we had furlough, we had support to businesses, and we had a lot of other stuff in the system that was keeping things going. This is a scale that's beyond what we could do, even if we replicated exactly that again. And I think you're right that there's that tension between trying to make sure we deal with the humanitarian need, as well as trying to stay holding on to what the longer term future is. But really positive to hear about that partnership with the Community Foundation as well, in terms of getting those groups out to grassroots groups, because I think we know, and there's lots of research, I'll plug it for you, Kate, on the London Community Foundation website, in terms of the power of the grassroots groups and the relationships the Community Foundation has there. So I think that's really strong, and thank you for sharing that, Manny. Last but not least, we'll come to you, Nezahat, for the London Legal Support Trust. And just a reminder to everyone else, if you do have questions and points you want to put to the panel, do just pop those into the Q&A box, because we'll be coming to the discussion shortly. But Nezahat, your thoughts from London Legal Support Trust.
Thank you, James. I think you can hear me, can't you? My microphone is a bit faulty this morning, but hope it will be fine. So thank you. I can say as others, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for bringing us together, because this is the time. I think we all need to be together to find common solutions to this massive situation we are in. So London Legal Support Trust is a charity that raises funds on behalf of legal advice services in London and the South East. The advice centers we support tell us, and we know, that people who are affected by the cost of living crisis hardest were poor to start with, and that has been mentioned to a degree by Manny as well. The pandemic added another layer of poverty to people who were already on the sharp edge, and the inflation rate of around 10% caused people to move from bad position to worse position. So this is what our funded organizations, partners, are telling us. The situation we are in doesn't only impact on people, we know that. So it's not only affecting people our funded partners are trying to help, but it also has vast implications for organizations we support. And again, that has been mentioned before. And also the broader ecosystem. Yolande mentioned about the situation local authorities are in, and our legal advice centers are also saying that those organizations provide support in court, saying that the rent areas that they're dealing with also giving a lot of issues to local authorities, so they're affected as well. The demand for advice services is increasing rapidly. The advice is one of the key services that is needed by thousands of people at this very difficult time. So what we are doing at LLSD, we've talked about collaboration, but collaboration is at the heart of everything we do here. Soon after the discussions around the cost of living occurred, we had a meeting with our funded advice services under the program we call Centers of Excellence. So we brought them together and we talked about the potential impact of cost of living on their clients and organizations. So the discussions then were taken to different collaboration levels that we are part of. And as a result, we worked with Greater London Authority, a group of specialist legal advice providers who are our centers of excellence, and the London Citizens Advice Partnership to increase advice capacity in London to help more people affected by the cost of living crisis. So the funding provides additional capacity for around 37 advice centers covering 26 London boroughs and employing around 60 advisors and apprentices. Another thing we have been working on, and this has again, the situation of workforce within the sector is worsened by the pandemic, and it was always there. So we always had workforce issues, but the situation was worsened by the pandemic. And now we are fearful that it's going to be even deeper crisis in workforce within the advice sector because of the cost of living, particularly in London. So we are working with a group of London funders, including Trust for London, the City Bridge, the Lottery, and some advice sector representatives to respond to workforce crisis within the advice sector, particularly within specialist advice sectors and also community-based organizations. And hopefully we'll come to kind of some details of those projects later on. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nezahat. And I think a really helpful summary there of both the challenge that's facing communities, but the challenge that's facing organisations trying to meet that demand, both in terms of their rising costs, but also some of the structural issues they were facing before, like workforce. And again, you'll see that in some of the work that we've done with London Funders. If you look at the immigration advice strategy that was put out, you can say, you can put a load of money into immigration advice, but if there aren't immigration advisors, you can't actually increase the level of, you've got to think about some of those structural issues as well. So thank you for flagging that. And also thank you for raising the issue of what you're actually doing about it as well. I think what's been really good about this conversation already so far is starting to get some practical sense of what people are doing and what can be done about this, because it can, Manny, you mentioned it, and I certainly feel it can feel slightly overwhelming personally and organisationally about how do we deal with things that are affecting us, our communities, people we care about. What are the solutions that we can come up with? So thank you for starting to share some of those. I'm going to try and sort of pick up on a few of the themes that you mentioned in your opening remarks. And again, a reminder to people, if you want to ask any questions or make any points, pop them in the Q&A box for us. One of the points you were making was about the sort of speed of action. And obviously during the pandemic, we saw that people did work differently to get money out faster to people, and we've talked a little bit about on this discussion so far about the tension between immediate humanitarian needs, which do need a very urgent funding response, as opposed to some of the longer term structural things, which is a different experience. So with charities calling on us to get money out quickly to address some of those urgent needs, and with the points you've made about the urgency of doing so as well, what do you think are some of the challenges that we're facing in actually getting money out, and how can we overcome those? How can we work differently to get money out faster where it is needed to different people? Manny, you talked about working through partners, for example, London Community Foundation. Is that a solution that you think can address barriers to people? Are there other things that we need to be thinking about in that mix?
Yeah, I think we have to play to each other's strengths when we work collaboratively here. So we could have taken two approaches. We could have just, to get stuff out quickly, we could have done two things. We could have given grants, extra grants to our existing grantees, because it's easy to do that because you don't have to go through the same due diligence process as you do if you're opening up your applications. but you're not going to reach as broad a spectrum of need as if you go out to open applications. And for us, it would have been very, very difficult with our current capacity levels to be able to do that quickly. And we know LCF can do that quickly and have, sort of probably a more light touch process than us, which really helps and can go really expert at getting out small grants, which we're not. So I don't think we have contributed, certainly in my time at the trust, to a funder in this way, where essentially we occasionally do give money to partners, but this is in COVID, we did all the work ourselves, essentially drawing down applications from the portal that London Funders have created, but we did the assessments. We're now saying LCF, you guys make the decisions, and we're going to give you some money to do that with some parameters around it. So that I think is really important. The other there are some challenges around things like giving grantees some uplifts of 10%, because they're sort of internal sort of admin systems challenges. But I think with that, it's slightly different. I hope that just by telling grantees you're going to get more money and it will come, that kind of provides a bit of relief. The humanitarian support needs immediate cash, because you have to buy stuff, you have to buy supplies, or you have to pay, you have to increase, you have to know you're going to open up your community centre for more days, and therefore you have to hire staff and so forth. So yeah.
No, thanks, Manny. I think that it's an important point as well about knowing the money's coming. So if you are currently in grants and there are additional resources coming, you can budget effectively for that if you know you can manage your cash flow accordingly. It was one of the bits that we got most from that we stand with the sector statement at the start of the pandemic, the fact that people said, we know funders are going to be on our side, we know we can have that conversation, let's just keep going, and we'll sort of retrofit it afterwards. So I think the knowledge gives a certain amount of power to being able to respond. But as you say, there's also the sort of fleet of foot bit that's needed to get money out quickly. And you mentioned the London Community Foundation. So Kate, if I come to you next in terms of how you're working to overcome some of the challenges of getting money out to groups quickly.
Thanks. So, we are incredibly appreciative of the opportunity to work with Manny and the team, and actually that reciprocity in terms of actually kind of also us using the data that Trust for London have such a great reputation for developing, actually also using that with the partners that we work with to help also kind of fundraise. So it does feel like a real collaborative effort. In terms of the appeal, some of this is also going to depend on actually kind of, as people will know, in terms of doing their own kind of fundraising appeals, whether at frontline organisations or otherwise within their own foundations, actually it will depend on actually how much we raise. And actually the really, really important thing there is actually how we communicate that to grantees and potential applicants, because actually the last thing we want to be able to do is to kind of either build up expectations or actually build up expectations in the wrong time. And actually so we will so we are looking at looking at this month in terms of preparing to launch. Actually we will try and keep it as light touch as possible. We will be kind of prioritizing some of the areas that we know are disproportionately impacted, people with living with disabilities, actually kind of some specific communities, actually kind of food, essential services, much like we saw, and taking a lot of the learning from the first wave of COVID funding that we collectively did together. And then depending on actually how much work we are raising, actually we will potentially kind of, again, using the learning that we've done with LCR, actually kind of is whether we try and kind of do it in waves. But actually kind of the most important thing we can do at the moment is be putting communication out through our newsletter and also on Twitter. So actually kind of I would, if there are any frontline grassroots organisations on the call, I would recommend that actually kind of you are signing up to those. And actually kind of also the really important thing for us to do is also be sharing kind of what we're seeing in terms of applications back with London funders as well. I don't know actually kind of whether or not there is and kind of I guess that's also kind of the purpose of potentially of this call, actually, in terms of actually, and this is a question, I guess, to London funders and also other foundations, are we sufficiently worried about this that actually kind of that's not, I don't mean that in a trick question, but actually are we going to see a level of actually kind of using the portal in the same way that we did before? Because that was a thing that actually kind of really, we were getting out grants in 4 days. And actually I know we weren't alone in that, and so there is a real plea in terms of kind of collaboration, and also actually how we're supporting London funders in terms of actually if that is something that we're going to do. I think the other thing, and listen, I know I'm preaching to the converted here. Actually, kind of, I don't need to say kind of lifting of restrictions and kind of reporting, and you know all of that in terms of actually kind of how to make this as efficient as possible for the grassroots organisations and the beneficiaries they're trying to serve. But there's also kind of the internal piece as well, that actually kind of how many of us actually kind of post-COVID went back to some of the governance structures and processes that we had before pandemic. Actually kind of LCF, through probably kind of some belligerence on my part, actually retained some of the kind of the changes that we'd made in terms of our own kind of governance structures, and said, look, actually kind of this is what we did during the pandemic. We don't need to go back to kind of what we did before, and by that I'm talking about kind of delegated authorities and kind of et cetera. Actually, kind of, we didn't actually kind of, and absolute testament to the kind of the LCF board and the kind of the governance structures that we did that, because if we can't do it now and we couldn't do it then, when are we going to do it? And actually kind of, and that's been a challenge, and how we've worked internally. So this is what we're doing externally, but actually also a challenge to us all about actually what's happening internally. Actually, which processes have we got that actually kind of, with hand on heart, actually do we need them? Because we know that that's the challenge that's put to us from frontline organisations, of actually kind of, there's some been really interesting, discussion around endowment performances, etc. at the moment. Yeah, and yes, and kind of we all have legal responsibilities. Our trustees have legal responsibilities, absolute in terms of actually kind of those. But actually, there are also processes in place that we've probably all collectively got that actually, hand on heart, actually kind of, do we need to look at them again?
Thanks, Kate. And I think you'll find to put questions to London funders, and they're questions we're grappling with as well, in terms of how best to respond. And we've got the research from talking to members that will come out in a report in next week that sort of highlights some of the key themes and some of the key opportunities. And as part of that, we're talking to our own trustees this week about what London funders' response next week, about what London funders' response should be and how we can do that. But I think one of the points you make, I'll just re-emphasize if I can, about the process changes as well, because one of the things we got asked a lot was, are you going to do another We Stand With the Sector statement? And our response to that, and I hope it's the right response, has been, we can't just keep doing a statement every time there's a crisis. If we're not changing the way that fundamentally we work as a funding community to better meet the needs of our communities, then we need to focus on that. So we've been very encouraging of people continuing on that journey to be more open and more trusting, and the IVAR commitments around the open and trusting grant makers movement, for us, exemplify some of the best practice in that area that builds on We Stand With the Sector. So we're, rather than saying sign up to another statement, we're saying, can you just keep doing what you've already said you were going to be doing? Can you keep on this journey to be open and trusting, and how can we support you to do that? So please do keep those kind of conversations going, because I think you're right, Kate, some of the barriers are internal as much as they are external, and how can we address those? So thank you for raising that. Nezahat, I mean, speed of response is an issue. Also, you were talking about a very quick response already through the networks that you have. Do you want to tell us a bit more about how that's worked and any challenges you've had to grapple with there?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So we are in a position that we were set up to raise funding on behalf of the legal advice centers, and therefore we have a very close working relationship and always have had. So it's not something new. One of the programs we run is Centers of Excellence, where about 40 centers in London, 39 in London and 1 in Southeast have been assessed and have met the criteria to become our Centers of Excellence, where we invest in them year on year without them reapplying. So those are the centers that we maintain, and we're hoping to actually increase the numbers. And the aim is to have 1 center in each London borough of London. London boroughs at the moment, there are 2 or 3 in 1 borough, so we don't cover the whole area. But this has given us a really fortunate situation where we have listened to the centers. We've had opportunities to meet them and listen to what they say. So we shape our policies, procedures according to what they tell us and how they want us to do. And in that sense, it's very easy. It has been very easy for us to get the money out because they've already gone our due diligence. They've already been funded by us. And as soon as they tell us that this is what they need, we can get the money out very quickly. And our processes are, again, before the COVID, it was pretty much kind of the similar, but after COVID and now with the cost of living crisis, we have a trustees subcommittee that deals with decisions with our grants, particularly emergency grants and other grants that we need to give out. And they have been tasked to make quicker decisions. And we have kept this after pandemic. We haven't changed that. So we are continuing to have the same structure as before. In terms of kind of I just want to mention something around emergency funding, because this is something that the centers are telling us that is needed more and more. We run a small emergency grant round for one-off capital funding, one-off setting up pro bono services, or genuine emergencies that organizations run into. So this is now becoming more and more common, those emergencies. And because they can approach us and tell us that this is the emergency they need, we need to get that money out very, very quickly. And sometimes on our own, we are not able to fund all of those emergencies. And this is where the collaboration comes into. And I think this is something that we did brilliantly under LCR, London Community Response, and all the systems are set up. We've had the experience, we already got set up the alliances. This is something we need to continue to look into those emergencies, because if those emergencies are not answered timely, like in the case of Lambeth Law Centre, for example, closed down, those services will close down. And it's so difficult to reset those services. Once you lose them, you lose them. It's very difficult to bring them back. So as funders, if we work together, then we can respond to those emergencies as well. Again, I think Manny mentioned 10% uplift for organizations. So what our centers are telling us that they are funded by different funders. But if one funder uplifts and the others don't, they cannot just raise one person's salary. They need to do something across the board. And this is something we need to have conversations with other funders, that can we all do similar stuff? Or can we just provide core funding, let them decide where actually they need that money for? Maybe they will increase across the board, but we need to provide unrestricted core funding. And this is quite kind of important. And I think whatever we do, and this is the Centers of Excellence, our grant funded partners are telling us, whatever we do, we need to make their lives easier so that they can concentrate on providing the very desperately needed services. That's what our role should be at this time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nezahat. And I think, again, important points about the importance of collaboration, not only in terms of getting money out, but in terms of knowing what each other's doing and how that lands with groups who are tackling the crisis on the ground, how you should make sure that that response is effective in that broader sense, which again speaks to some of the points Kate was making about the process and how you do that in a way that's effective too. Thank you for that. Yolande, can I come to you, because obviously local authorities have a take on this as well, and will also be grappling with their own need to get resources out quickly in terms of services. How is that being balanced from your perspective?
Thanks, James. So I think one of the things that you and I and other colleagues across London Funders have talked about a lot, and everybody's touched on this, is we learned so much during COVID, and we were always like really worried that we kind of snap back to old practices. Actually, it's forcing us to genuinely again rethink about how do we embed those good practices that we identified during COVID, and let's just not kind of take them out the cupboard again for another crisis, embed them in our practice. And actually that is genuinely something that boroughs are looking at the moment. We also know that for many of the boroughs, they're not necessarily going to be able to find more money, but actually how do they get the money out in a different way? So for example, different models of working with voluntary community and faith sector partners, for example. So thinking about Barking and Dagenham and their 9 local hub model, actually they support the hubs So they give the hubs money, and it's the hubs decision about how they then fund things like the Barnet Together Alliance. So that alliance received a really big investment, and they're investing in then community-led approaches to actually helping with cost of living. So rather than the borough then taking on it, it's actually saying, actually, that's a group of people who really know what they're doing, and they're going to support those community-led approaches. And that's just a couple of examples of different ways of doing things. And, you know, coming back to that, actually, we have to work with voluntary community and faith sector partners as trusted partners, because they can help us get that money out in different ways. It's also about how we utilise and share other different types of resources. So whilst we're obviously talking about how we get money out to groups, we can't underestimate how important it is to make sure that individuals are getting more money in their pockets, in their wallets and their bank accounts. I was talking to a colleague in a borough recently who mentioned that they worked with a big group of voluntary sector partners to actually just have not just information sessions, but helping people fill out forms for benefits, for example, and entitlements. And during a single day where they saw a load of people, 80% of the people that they saw weren't claiming benefits that they were entitled to, didn't know about entitlements that they were entitled to, or were underclaiming. 80%. So the key takeaway that the borough took from that was actually got together again with their voluntary community sector partners and said, right, who do we need to train? Which frontline members of staff do we need to support? How can we kind of just bring a group of people together from across our organisation to do some of that? So no, it wasn't about money, but actually it was about how do we use the resources we got within the borough to support the work that you're doing. So we also need to think about it in terms of all the other kind of collateral and resources we've got to help. I think the bit that we will always struggle with as boroughs is, and you know, Kate talked about the fact that we've all got governance and we've all got people with legal responsibilities. Boroughs' legal responsibilities are out there in the public domain constantly. So some of the issues around Nezahat talking about things like core funding, for example, can be a bit more of a challenge. So I think we need to be better at talking to other local funders around, look, we're in a situation here, we have to fund services, but we want to work with you. So if you can support core funding for these key voluntary sector partners in the local area, that makes it easier for us to fund the services. You know, how are boroughs working more closely with their place-based giving schemes, those sorts of things. And all of those things start to make a difference. But we can't just do it for now. I think we have to really start embedding these different approaches as all of us as funders.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ellen. So I think really important, both that cross-sector piece, but also the how do we use the resource to make sure people are accessing the resource points, and how do we use some of what's already in play to make better use of assets and opportunities that are available. And I guess that's my next question I wanted to put you all was sort of the tension between needing to know what's happening and getting money there effectively in real time with the current crisis, whilst also keeping our eye on some of the longer term needs and making sure that we're supporting the sector to be stronger. So both in terms of a future crisis, but also just making sure we're dealing with some of the structural crises that we're grappling with. Manny, can I come to you first on that one, just in terms of how we get that balance right between keeping our eye on the longer term whilst also dealing with the here and now?
Yeah, well, it's really tricky, I think, in terms of building the capacity of the sector to contribute in the long term. We're in a resource scarce environment, and whatever happens, the voluntary sector always gets limited resources and deals with them, so it has to have uncertainty that's sort of baked into the model, really. And it's tricky. I think what we're all relying on is that these sorts of experiences build a sense of muscle memory in funders, but also in the organisations themselves. Communities are great at stepping up when there's a crisis, and we had a crisis in COVID, and actually it doesn't feel like that long ago. So we kind of hope that the same sort of networks and the same sort of action will kind of come about this time round. And then over time, hopefully that helps build the kind of networks and relationships and skills that enable people to respond to the next crisis. But if it's next crisis in 10 years' time, that may well wane. But for us as funders, it's very much about learning from this, about speed, but also, as Nezahat said, and it's core funding. So really what we want to say in this crisis is you guys tell us what the best response for your community is, and let's fund that, rather than us sort of saying, you know, here are the sort of the exact activities you want to take on, really.
Brilliant, thanks, Manny. Yolande, could I come to you on this one as well? Because I think again, that long-term perspective is something that's part of council planning as well. So how do you think we can balance that well?
I really want to echo Manny in that actually boroughs are getting better at, rather than them specifying what they want groups to spend money on, is actually saying what does the community need. And actually we work with partners because we're saying we need your help, and actually we need to trust your expertise. So if you're saying that this is where the funding needs to go, that's what we need to do. So for me, that's quite critical. And we also need to, bearing in mind how local government works, we need to make sure that officers in boroughs are supporting their elected members to really make sure they're getting as close as possible to their community, so that they can see what those needs look like, so that we've got good, strong support just from our kind of political leaders as well. I think one of the things that we continue to do more and more of, and yes, it was definitely thrust upon us in a way that none of us expected through COVID, is actually direct community work. I mean, I think about some of the brilliant work that happens in places like Camden, Newham, where actually the first port of call is speaking to the community, speaking to community leaders, and actually working with them to identify how we support activity, how we support individuals, and how we support people. So I'm basically saying what Manny said in a slightly different way.
It's good when we have collaborative answers to questions about collaboration as well, Yolande. So thank you for collaborating in that way too. Nezahat, your thoughts on the balance between short-term and long-term eye on future?
I'm going to continue on that collaboration, I think, spirit. In terms of where the need is and what we need to, where we need to invest our money, we have enormous data collected through LCR, for example, and also we have enormous data collected collectively between us. So we do collect a lot of data. I think we have enough, and we do have a good knowledge of where the needs are, where we need to invest. And to be honest, you know, everywhere there money is needed or funding is needed, our funding is needed. But the difficulty is we also have limited resources. I think in terms of long term, and again, it's very tricky, as Manny said, we don't know where we're going to be in 2 years or 3 years time ourselves, let alone kind of thinking about that long term. But let's be positive and see what we can do in the future together. I think something that we don't do enough is the policy side of things as trusts and foundations, because every time there's a crisis, we try to pick up, you know, where the need is and where the gaps are, but we don't have enough to be answer to everything. So while we try our best to do whatever we can to help people, I think we should also send really strong messages out that we are not able to pick up everything, anything and everything that is created by policies and procedures. And we need to send that message quite strongly out together. And that's something that we don't do enough. And hopefully we can do a little bit more of that as well in long term.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nezahat. Also using the experience of the short term to also influence the long term, as well as the more structural issues there. And last on this one, Kate, obviously we talked about the speed that you're getting money out right now, but that's obviously building on long-term relationships you have with groups and with the sector. So your thoughts on that balance between short and long term?
I have three points to make here very quickly. Is number one, I don't know if everybody else is finding, but I am finding it very difficult for my brain to be anything that vaguely looks like strategic at the moment. And you know, kind of it's just really hard. And also I'm reflecting on kind of actually what do I do with that, you know. So I think there's that. I think you know, the benefit of our model is that that we're giving away so many grants on an annual basis because we have so many different funds on a business as usual basis, that actually kind of the actual team's engagement with grassroots organizations across some of those really priority areas actually is fantastic, and actually kind of and really kind of however we can share that with London funders, we'd be very willing to do so. I think the other point as well is actually kind of we're just doing a round at the moment of kind of a lot of comms work, and that's just building on the survey that we've done, and actually kind of that's just giving us a level of engagement that kind of, that I hope keeps us accountable in terms of how we work with grassroots organisations. But the other thing I wanted to say is within London Funders, there is just an innate understanding of just how much public service delivery, I'm saying public service, not public sector delivery, that charities in London are doing. But actually kind of that's us talking to ourselves. And I think there is a whole world out there who has no concept of just how much the charity sector is picking up and has been for years. And I think kind of we are at a stage where actually kind of I think we have to be very explicit about actually kind of how much the charity sector is carrying, and actually kind of, and that's also about informing the public. However we do that, in whatever our missions are as charities, I think we have a responsibility now to start talking about just what the charity sector is carrying, and who's paying for what. And actually kind of, and who is shouldering that responsibility of incredibly vulnerable people and doing it willingly and doing it again and again. I think kind of actually as London Funders, we need to be talking to sectors that actually we don't normally talk to, because we all know, you know, because that's what we're doing.
Brilliant, thank you, Kate. And you're certainly not alone in having a brain that is battered by this. I think a common feeling, and certainly one I feel. And I think from discussions with many of our members, there's that feeling about, well, what do we do? So if you don't mind, I'm going to finish up by a quick round of what do we do? You know, people on the call right now who are listening to you, if they were to take away a thought, a sort of call to action that you have for them, or it could be a call to action that you have for London Funders, as a result of the Cost of Living Week, as a result of the conversation today, what thought do you have in your mind about what practical thing should happen now? What step could people take? What big action could they take? However big or small that action is, what can people do after today's call? Yolande, do you mind if I come to you first for a call to action?
Thank you, James. And actually, that nice. It's I'm going to hopefully flow quite nicely from some of what Kate was saying there. London councils exist to be strategic, so we do continue to really push for those long-term asks for government. Kate's point around, you know, we just continue to dig deep, and the charity sector, how much the charity sector is supporting public services is hugely important. But boroughs have continued to step up as well. It's one of the reasons that government have continued to cut our funding. So we are now at the stage where those conversations with government around a proper financial settlement for local government become hugely important. But I'm going to wear two hats now, my London Council's hat and my London Funders trustee hat. Yes, Kate, you and many others just don't have the space for that strategic thinking. So let's get around a table with London Funders to make sure that we're picking up, you know, some of that strategic thinking that you want to have, so we can bring it back into London Council. So when we're making our arguments to government, they're part of our calls to action to government as well. We're not doing it on our own. And we do now talk quite differently to government. We don't just talk about local authorities, we also talk about the voluntary and community sector as well. But we need to make sure that we're baking those into our calls to government.
Brilliant, thank you, Yolande. Nezahat, your thoughts, call to action.
Thank you, James. The policy element, I think, has been quite nicely put by Kate and Yolande. So I'm not going to talk about that because that was going to be one of my action points. But definitely we need to come together to both strategically think about the future, but also what is happening wider, you know, outside us, and how can we influence, because we do have some power. How can we influence that kind of decision-making process outside of this establishment that we are part of? The second thing I would say, communicate, because the organizations out there, organizations that are funded, organizations that are expecting to be funded, they are extremely worried. They're worried, and they probably don't know what we are doing enough. I think we need to communicate our intentions and plans to organizations who are extremely worried. And that would be my second call for action. And London Funders can play a role in both, actually, of those actions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nezahat. Manny, your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know about anyone else on the call, but all of these crises we go through, I always think the world is going to be better afterwards, the financial crisis or the pandemic, and as everyone was shaking their heads, it's never better, it's just been getting worse for 10 years. But it does feel like things have changed this time, and there is a noticeable shift in public attitudes, and people are fed up of crises, even though this crisis is about to get a whole lot worse for almost everyone. So I think actually this is probably, I'm going to give it one more go. I'm going to have some hope that the world is going to be better after this crisis, because I think the public is up for it. And our job is to really take our experiences of going through this and to have faith up, translating that into what can be better in the long term will eventually land home with those who can really affect that.
Brilliant, thank you. Hold on to that hope, Manny. Kate, last call to action from you.
Yeah, I think what Manny's talking about there is a new social contract that's based on values and principles, is how I would read it. I would say actually there's a whole world within London as well that actually is not on this call, that has money to support. And actually kind of, James, you've heard me say this a lot recently. I'm going to say it again. I'm not going to make any apologies for it. We have so many wealth advisors, private banks, intermediaries who need to be unlocking money that can support London at the moment. And I think kind of, Yolande, to your point of kind of strategic kind of coming together, actually kind of been a number of challenges about how do we collectively help philanthropy and giving work more effectively in London, because it is complicated. Actually kind of, we have to try and do it. And you know, that's, by the way, this is not me saying then the money comes to LCF. You know, if the money stays in London, you know, it's not about LCF, it's about actually the money staying in London, then money navigating itself to London's communities.
Fantastic, thank you, Kate. So you've heard it here from our fantastic panel. I'm very grateful to Kate, Yolande, Nezahat and Manny for joining us today to think about what actions we can take, what can we do as a result of all the things you've been hearing over the last week as part of our cost of living week, but all that you're hearing from your grantees, from your partners, about the challenges that London and our communities face. I'll end, if I can, with just a bit of a call to action to all of you on the call, and anyone who's watching this later on. Do keep these conversations going, do keep these connections going. For people who weren't able to make it today, your colleagues, your team members, we will be putting a recording of this on our YouTube channel later, so please do make sure that they're aware of these conversations too. Tell us what you're doing as well. If you've got a call to action, if there's something that you're working on that you want to bring others together around to collaborate on, to make sure that it's part of that system of responding together, do please get in touch with the London Funders team so we can keep an eye on everything that's happening and try to make those connections for you. Do keep an eye on the Funder 5 newsletter that comes out every Friday that has summaries both this time of some of the activities and the key messages from this week, but next week we'll also be sharing the report that we have produced on what funders are thinking about and what they're doing right now, so you can get a sense of that bigger picture. And also look out later on today from us for some news about some longer term funder collaboration work that's going on and your opportunities to be part of that as well, because as colleagues have said on this call, as we've heard from members and as we know from the work that we've done before, by working collaboratively, by working together, we're stronger across sectors and we're better placed to respond to the needs of our communities, both now in terms of this crisis and in terms of the longer term structural issues that we need to address to be a fairer, stronger, greener society as well. So thank you for being part of the conversation today. Thank you again to our panel. Please do keep in touch with us so that we can take the action that's needed now and for the future. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day and we'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.